I'm going to take it from now. Our next presenter is Sajan, and he will be talking about using NetBox as a data broker for DHCP and DNS.
So it's a data broker project. And this is an ongoing project kind of at the start of it. And I'm happy to take this opportunity to kind of share it with the community, ask for feedback, ask for help, and see where this goes. It is currently unnamed, but data broker is kind of the best way I can describe it. And before we kind of get going here, let me see if I can pin this. Just to kind of recap, the NetBox community is made up of a lot of different backgrounds. Obviously, there's a pitch of NetBox to be a data center infrastructure management system. It's heavily used by people like us that are software developers, DevOps guys. But if we go back to the fundamentals, the main two reasons something like NetBox is valuable to a company is it provides a form of documentation, and we can leverage that for automation of tons of different things, as I think everyone to some degree is going to talk about today. However, if I can get to the next slide, automation is hard. So if we, like my previous presenter, works for MLB, there are resources there. If you are in a managed hosting environment, there are resources there. If you are just in general a technology company, you have certain technical resources that not every single company that would benefit from just the use of NetBox necessarily has. So it's great as a data store, but leveraging it to do all these advanced things that we're talking about in our communities today is a little bit of a bridge too far for some other audiences. So my goal here today is kind of go through just kind of one path, one story that we encountered, and kind of how we're solving that for at least that audience, and see where its place may be in the broader community here. To give you guys a little context, my name is Sajan Parikh. My background started off as more the infrastructure systems guy in a fairly scaled virtual environment, providing managed services. From there, I kind of became more of a software architect and developer. And then more recently, I've been working with a lot of service providers, specifically WISPs, which we'll get into in a second. And that work was a lot more operational, as much as it was technical. So combining kind of all that together, I've kind of got a different insight, I think, for the small service providers out there in the world that can benefit from something like NetBox. And a lot of my exposure comes with my work at IP Architects. IP Architects, just very two-sentence summary, we're a global consulting firm. We do route switch network design and architecture. And we work with different sectors. We work with the service providers of the world, we work with data centers, and we work with enterprises. And it's important to kind of understand our different levels of exposure across these different sectors, because we are put in a unique position of, as a team, having insight into how service providers work, data centers work, and how the enterprises work, and the different tools that exist in all of those ecosystems, and how they might work together. And what we've come to find is there's tools that the small guys would benefit from that they've never heard of. And some of them are not necessarily cost prohibitive. It's just outside that community. And there's some efficiencies or some ways of doing things in the larger Fortune 50 space that they are blind to, just due to general bureaucracy, red tape, etc. So as we've gone through this exercise of working with our different clients and kind of giving everybody insight into the best of the other world, delivering the greener grass, so to speak, we've realized that a lot of those conversations, no matter which sector that we're in, ultimately end up with NetBox, or start with NetBox, I should say. Because NetBox kind of is useful as a data origin. Whether I am a mom and pop WISP or a large data center, or an enterprise with a IT department and $80 million of revenue, NetBox can become the sort of starting place for all of the future changes that we may implement or execute or plan. whether it's just redesigning the network or understanding the IP planning, or even for us to do a discovery and audit of a system or a network. We kind of start with NetBox. It just kind of creeps its way into the conversation. So when we start with NetBox for a WISP, there's a couple of hurdles just in general for a WISP. And now, if you guys haven't, or if you guys aren't familiar with the term WISP, WISP is a type of ISP. It's an internet service provider that delivers much of the middle mile and last mile, definitely the last mile, wirelessly. So these are small guys in rural America. There's actually about 3,000 of them in the United States alone. Some of you may, you either know what a WISP is or you absolutely don't. So if you go to like the farmlands of Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Nebraska, a lot of those areas don't have the physical infrastructure for cable or fiber, or honestly even dial-up in some cases. So these WISPs kind of pop up, and they put some radio gear on a tower, and they're literally broadcasting 802.11. I mean, not, a little bit more advanced than that, but they can deliver wireless internet service that competes with traditional, ISPs that can do cable and fiber. Not on speed, but these days on latency and experience, I would have no problem being on a WISP myself. But because of that particular niche that they operate in, they're generally smaller. It's generally the mom and pops of the world, and then oftentimes these are companies, quote unquote, where the husband is doing the installs and service calls and tower work and keeping the network alive as best as he can, and the wife is essentially taking the phone calls and doing the books. So in that type of environment, the network kind of gets built in the heat of the need, and a lot of things that you and I might want to do that are proper for documentation and backups and monitoring, some of that stuff doesn't always get done correctly, which is where we find ourselves in helping in a lot of cases. And they're resource limited essentially, and it's not, a lot of times it is capital because these guys generally don't have a technical background. This is kind of a way for them to get themselves internet as a second job, and they may not know anything about networking. But if it's not, capital or expertise, that's the barrier here. Time definitely is a barrier. And to compound on that, you think about what's happening in the world today, where almost overnight the entire world decided to move a lot more stuff through the internet, and it had a lot more need of the internet. These WISPs have actually enjoyed an explosive growth in new customers. So when things like that happen, a lot of needs end up getting put on the wayside. So monitoring, for example, backups, IPAM, just normal maintenance and management and best practices for a lot of the systems, the supporting systems of the ISP, more or less get ignored, or there's no real way to meet those needs as an organization. So when we come in and we work with these ISPs, these WISPs in particular, we start with NetBox as a way of just starting to put things down. But NetBox kind of out of the box, so to speak, there's a lot of things going on. It's certainly an IPAM. It certainly can handle tenants and sites and APs and backhauls and all this different equipment that goes in. But we generally start with just an IPAM because that really is a lot easier to implement and a lot easier to understand the benefits of than going down the rabbit hole of documenting the color of the cable from patch panel A to patch panel B. So we start with IPAM. So we help them kind of put everything in there, see why the network is messed up, and we inevitably find that they've got one big subnet stretched across over multiple sites in RF, and we can help them kind of plan those migrations in NetBox, and it gets their feet wet. It helps them understand the value of this type of documentation and software. So as they're getting their feet wet with NetBox, what inevitably happens is, hey, so this data's in here. We put all the IPs in here. I've started putting this network sites in there. All of my towers, all of my POP locations are in NetBox now. But it would be nice if they went into this other system as well because I need it over there. And I'm only one guy. I don't have time to make sure that I entered it in NetBox and in my billing system, for example, in this case, PowerCode. Or if you have employees, human error is obviously a thing, and we all know this. This isn't a completely new concept of keeping the data in all the places we need it. So these WISPs, they're just being introduced this concept of proper documentation, and now we're kind of leveraging a little bit more automation, or at least data syncing. So it starts off very simple. It's like, hey, can we just sync my sites over so that my sales guys know that this new site is ready or in development, so they can process leads, essentially, because they would then know that this potential customer is within the radius of this tower. So we write a script, and now things that go into NetBox, they show up in their billing system or their sales CRM as a new site there. And then some time goes by, and they're liking this. It's working. And then they come back and say, oh, by the way, remember that monitoring thing you told me about? Can we make it so that if I put something in NetBox, it shows up over there? Because I didn't have time before to do it between NetBox and my CRM. I certainly don't have time to put it in 3 places. And again, if the employees do it, something's going to get missed. The wrong thing's not going to get monitored, and then I'll be dark when I need it the most. So it's like, okay, we can write another script for that, and just handle an incoming webhook on NetBox's CRUD events, and get things into something like LibreNMS, right? These aren't like fancy tools that we would use in the enterprise space or in the Fortune 50 space, but these are the tools that they work for this size of audience. So we write another script. So now we've got 2 things going: one to sync all the sites over as they come in, one to take all the routers and switches and RF gear and throw them into Libre as they get created or removed and updated, etc. So now we have 2 things going on. No big deal. Well, some more times go by. And now it's like, hey, all these VMs that I'm starting to run as I grow my business, I'm not a Linux guy. I mean, my job was a CPA. I started this ISP because I needed my internet and thought I'd help out my neighbors too. So now we're in a situation where this VMware farm is coming online, and the best practices there are be damned. Ultimately, the problem is this guy's not a Linux user. So when we did the IP planning, this guy is just running all of his servers off of DHCP. Well, he has the right idea to do static IP addresses, but I mean, who has ever tried to edit a YAML file without understanding that YAML is white space dependent? And then you have people that have never used it at all. They're copying and pasting things from browsers, and inevitably, NetPlan grows crazy. The Ubuntu server's down. Now there's no DNS for anything, as an example. So hey, if we can get NetBox to populate a DHCP server with the right MAC address, that would be cool. And these are all just examples. But we do that. But now we have 3 scripts going. And they're all doing different things that were done in the heat of the need for those individual use cases. And we've got a lot of different data going around. Now, in a bigger enterprise space, this is not a big deal, because we would have proper change management, chain of authority. We would have proper ways of maintaining, managing, supporting, and documenting the different pieces that make up our systems and network. And we would want them to be separate in some cases, for the flexibility, for the granularity. However, in the cases that we encounter with WISPs specifically, or even small enterprises, that adds a level of complexity that becomes a little hard to deal with, especially for them if the idea is for them to stand on their own 2 feet. So the idea came up is, how do we make this more organized and make it a package that is easy to digest, deploy, and maintain for somebody that doesn't have any other needs other than data getting from point A to point B. So we have some goals. We want it to be easy to deploy. So if this guy is complaining because he's never used Linux before, having all these Python scripts and cron jobs and CLI tools, that becomes a little difficult to digest. These guys just want something to download, install. I mean, it should be as simple as the famous 5-minute WordPress install, right? That's the goal, at least. Maintainable, so that we don't have a lot of different snippets flying around, and there's kind of an order and architecture to an overall software here. And make it expandable, because today, like in my example in these slides, we only talked about a monitoring system, a DHCP server, and a CRM, but there's a lot of other things that you can bolt onto this that just need very simple point A to point B data transport without complexity and without scripting. And the easiest way to give the customer or the user in this case the ability to kind of choose what goes where is leveraging the roles and tags, just like the previous presenter did for the backups. Is, I want this to be backed up. I don't want this to be backed up. I want this to go to this Libre server, not this one. So we have a few goals. So we architected something. We started working on this with a few of our customers. And it looks something like this. I'm not very good at Lucid charts. I'm a software guy. I'm not very good at PowerPoint either. So, I could write this all in HTML and CSS, but that didn't quite work. But the idea is we have CRUD events that happen in NetBox. And, those webhooks and those changes get notified to our one app, so to speak. And we can ingest that object once. We can ingest what type of action is needed. We can go through all the filtered stuff, whether it's roles, tenants, tags, device type, manufacturer, because we may want to do different things based on all of those values. And then we have all these services configured and connected to this app. This app knows about the CRM. It knows what should go into CRM and what shouldn't based on those filters. It knows about LibreNMS. It knows about something like Opmantech. And in those are two NMSs, by the way. So the idea is we would only put RF devices based on the manufacturer in Libre, and then we can put all of the kind of on-the-ground routers and switches in something like Opmantech automatically. But this app is aware of how to connect to these services and how the data is to be transported. And from a software standpoint, we organize this by essentially defining an interface. And depending on which language you may be familiar with, the term contract might be appropriate as well. But defining a standard of how data is acted upon for any particular third-party application or third-party destination, it allows us to very easily organize different things in different applications where this data ends up needing to be. So we have NetBox, it goes to our app. The app kind of figures out who needs to be notified about this. And because they're all written the same way, we don't really care. It just kind of happens. And it's all written to a standard interface or a contract. So we've started working on this, and it's a very simple stack right now. A LEMP stack. If you're, I know a lot of this community is very Python oriented. But I do have a different vision for this app that just made it a little bit more comfortable being in PHP and Laravel. And Composer is going to play an important role here. Composer is the package manager for PHP. So the way that we are writing this at the moment is all of the individual connectors. So all the icons, all the kind of logos you see in the middle there, and as many as you can think of that fit in that category. The idea is its implementation of the set standard contract or interface could live as its own package. That way you're only loading in what you need, or if you want to write your own, you can very easily do so. Just submit your own package and boom, it's available to you in the software. We enumerate all the classes and make it available essentially. That way you can write your own stuff without ever having to touch the source code of the actual broker app. And we can make this queue-based, right? So if we've got a couple things going on and we have one piece of new equipment that needs to be going to the CRM because it's a backhaul, so we need the RF frequency, we need to know, what needs to be in the CRM, but we also want to start backing it up. So it needs to be in two places. We can queue those two, and if one succeeds, great, but if the one fails, we can act on it. We can be notified that, hey, this thing didn't make it into your CRM. And then we can either keep retrying it, or we can have reports and kind of go in that direction. So to kind of wrap up here, where we are at right now is the framework's done. Most of the architecture is done in a way that at least I can use it. The goal here is to make this open source and publish this within the next, let's just say a few weeks. I've got to clean up a lot of Git history. I tend to curse a lot when things are broken. So I got to go and squash a bunch of commits and remessage those. But moving some of these connectors into their own package, documentation, and then just having a UI to quickly add different instances of different supported services. So, we can have 2 different Libre services, for example. And based on the tenant that you set a particular site to or a particular device to in NetBox, we can choose to send it to a different instance of LibreNMS or a different instance of Observium, for example. And that's useful in the case that you're kind of managing somebody else's equipment, or you're providing, MPLS type delivery, and that you've got other people's equipment in your network that you're tracking, but you want to give them access to the monitoring of it. So here's a way that you can easily kind of just use the tenants as a flag to say this customer needs to be able to see this in their system. So yeah, those are the next steps. This should be on GitHub in the next few weeks, hopefully. And that's about it. Hopefully I came in on time or under time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sajan, for your presentation. That's great. Just digging through the questions right now in the Q&A on WebEx. Trying to fight the the little Q&A window here. I don't see any questions at the moment, but guys, if you have any questions that pop up, please go ahead and throw them in the Q&A window. I do want to point out real quick, for those who might not be familiar with WebEx, there are 2 actual chat dialogues. One is kind of a general purpose chat, and one is specifically for Q&A, and you'll see that show up below. You should see it show up as a panel below the chat on the right-hand pane. So if you have any questions for Sajan, we'll go ahead and keep you on for a couple minutes. It's always a little bit difficult, obviously, with a virtual interface, and I appreciate everyone's patience as we try to work around this. But if you don't mind just hanging out for a couple minutes, and if any questions pop up, I'll go ahead and relay those for everyone to hear, for anyone who might not be following along in the chat. And barring that, we've got a couple minutes left, and then we'll go ahead and hand it off to Greg when he's ready at 11:40 Eastern. Will be the next talk.
Cool. Yeah, just to reiterate, there's a question about when this will be available. I could probably push it up today if I wanted to. Put it out it's a little bit messy at the moment. There's some deployment issues that I could clean up to make it a little bit easier, but ideally this would deploy, because essentially just a web server with some crons. So there's a script that I'm using to automatically do this on Ubuntu 2004 to install all the right packages, copy over some configs, and make this running essentially. And that's probably something that I can get done in the next couple of weeks is my goal here. There's another question. Is this framework only listening to NetBox webhooks, or is it using the webhook to get further information out of NetBox using APIs? It is using further calls back to NetBox. So if a webhook comes in, depending on the context or depending on where it needs to go and what information is ultimately required for the destination, there are instances where we are reaching back out to NetBox. So for example, there's a case where we have this running against ISC for Power DNS, for reverse DNSs. So when something comes in for an IP address object, there is a little bit of logic going back to NetBox to make sure we're putting this in the right zone, for example, that there's no weirdness to subdomains and how just reverse DNS works. So there is a mechanism to go back out to NetBox as well.
I'll add one more question in there, Sajan. First off, great picture on the slide. It's always good to see. I'm just curious, have you dug into plugins at all in NetBox? And any thoughts of what you've done and creating one or more plugins as a data broker?
Yeah, so great question. And as I was kind of knee deep in doing this for clients, the plugin thing was not on my radar. Now that that's kind of out, I definitely will be, and that's also part of why I want to delay this a little bit too, is understanding exactly which pieces can fit into a plugin and which pieces can kind of sit outside of the plugin. Going back to kind of the vision for this and who this is more targeted to, there may be different levels of control needed that may ultimately be easier to live outside of a plugin into kind of a separate area rather than jam everything in. But it just depends. I haven't really dug into plugins just yet. I should have had a clock going. I could have gone slower.
No, no worries. There's a couple other questions in the Q&A at the bottom there. If you want to cherry pick them, we've got about 4 minutes, I think, to the next.
Oh, I did not see
we have
those.
time for one or two.
Is there any connector that works with MSAD and DHCP? So right now, that's not something that I've encountered. I haven't worked on personally. But if you think about the way that this is structured, essentially there's one PHP interface, and it defines. If you can see, I don't know if this is blocking you guys or not, but it defines a few different methods, and you can implement those methods however you end up wanting to. So create, update, delete, and sync. The sync is one that's going to be executed from this data broker app, which will go out to a model and basically go rip out all the objects and make sure that they are what they're supposed to be. I just lost all the questions. There's a question about limitations with NetBox in your integration. I haven't really encountered anything that has prohibited what's been done so far. NetBox has been developed in a very awesome way where that pretty much everything is available via the API. So like I mentioned earlier, there's some cases where a webhook will come in and I'll want to go back out to NetBox to get other contextual information from other objects, other models that maybe wasn't included in the webhook. So as long as like that logic is acceptable and works, there really shouldn't be any limitations that I can see in the way this is done.
I appreciate that shout out for the REST API there. We've made some, I just want to add on, we've made some improvements recently with webhooks in that they can now be templatized. So you have the ability to write a Jinja 2 template for both the payload as well as the headers.
Yep.
So that is an option out there. And we are actually working on making that a little bit more robust in that right now the webhook generator is being fed serialized data from the object. We're working on changing that to a full actual Python instance of the object, which gives you a little bit more, the ability to query related objects and such. So that is an open feature request. Just wanted to throw that out there. At this point, we're approaching the next talk. So Sajan, virtual round of applause. Thank you very much for your presentations. Excellent work.
Thank you for having me.
At this point, absolutely, sir.